A climate and energy policy group warns of a likely power shortage across the Luzon grid this summer and during the height of the elections in May. Joining us now is Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, Bert Dalusung, to tell us if we should be concerned. So, Bert, why should we be concerned that there could be a potential power supply shortage this summer?
Yes, Rico. I think that if we look at the projections of the government through National Grid Corporation of the Philippines and through DOE, we're seeing an optimistic, what we call an optimistic scenario. And it's optimistic because they are saying that we would not have any outages of power plants. However, based on our previous studies, we find that outages do occur. So looking at the government forecast, we did our own two additional scenarios. One we called the conservative scenario and another our pessimistic scenario. And in both cases, we're seeing the possibility of red alerts. So when we're at the red alert, we don't have security of reserves. And those are the times when we have the outages, meaning blackouts at the end user level.
So if we are on a red alert, Bert, how much power do we need in reserve to be able to get over the hump?
Yeah, well, you know, there are several reserve capacities needed by our grid. I've mentioned three. First is regulating reserve, normally 4% of the projected demand for that interval. And remember, we have 5-minute intervals now in the scheduling of our power system. And then you have the contingency reserve that should be at least as large as the largest unit operating in that grid. And finally, a dispatchable reserve equivalent to the second largest unit. So I would say that we should have around 1,500 megawatts, more or less, depending on the actual hour of the day or time of day.
1,500 megawatts of reserve power supply. What do we currently have? How much is the thinning of our power supply at the moment? And when can we expect these power outages, Bert, to start?
Well, actually, NGCP publishes that information daily, I believe. So you can see Luzon grid, 1,500 or so megawatts for that day predicted. Now, what is important is look at the history. Look at the previous performance of the grid. We find that even if we expect 1,500 or even more reserve, there are times when we don't get those reserves because our power plants fail. They have what is called forced outage, unplanned outage. In other words, they were supposed to be operating, but they did not for whatever technical reason. That's a common experience. And in fact, I'd like to point you to January 11, where I think we had 6 units fail. 4 of those are the same 4 units that failed last year in the time, I think between May 30 and June 1, when we had those rotating blackouts in Luzon.
And what could make the situation worse, Bert, is that the National Water Resources Board said today that Metro Manila may experience a water shortage by April or May. And those are the same months of your predicted power supply shortage. So this is double jeopardy.
Well, yeah, we hope that this can be averted. In fact, that's precisely the reason why we came out with that report. We want to raise awareness. We'd like to say that maybe even now, all agencies involved will do their part in managing their power consumption, using more efficient power devices, and so on, scheduling their use of electricity. We think that government, commercial and industrials, and even residentials can help during this critical time. For example, even an ordinary household can manage its consumption during the most critical time of the day, which is 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. That's where we have our peak demand in the Luzon grid.
But the big question now is, Bert, how does this thinning energy supply endanger the actual conduct of the May 9, 2022 elections?
Well, I was reading the papers, and apparently COMELEC has started to look more closely into their contingency measures. That's good. That's precisely consistent with our intention for the report. I think that there are several programs that the government can do. I know that there's an interruptible load program, voluntary load curtailment. What this means is if you're a commercial or industrial, you can run your own generation so that you don't have to take from the grid. And in that, with that, what you do is you reduce the requirement and therefore conserve the reserve capacity that we have.
But what about the largest players and our industries in the country? What steps should they take to prevent such a crisis from materializing?
Well, I think the most important is we should make sure that the optimistic scenario actually occurs. In other words, no brownouts, no forced outages on the part of generators. So I think DOE is monitoring the situation very closely, looking at the fuel inventories and so on. So everyone, I believe, is aware within the power sector, but still we have to be prepared for what we call our typical occurrences in the power grid.
And briefly, Bert, no, we've had this power issue problem since time immemorial. It has taken so many decades to resolve our power supply issue. Why haven't we really gotten the problem fixed? And what must the next administration do for our kababayans to have consistent power supply, and we won't have these issues again and problems of power outages during the summer months?
Yeah, well, you know, I've been in the energy sector for about 4 decades. And I think that we really need to take a long, hard look at our planning paradigm. We've always said that we need enough base load and peaking resources. I think that we should move towards a system that recognizes the inherent variability of our load. We need a more flexible power system. We need a more diverse or distributed power system. In other words, we spread out the capacity, because if one of the large baseload power plants fail, that's, in our case, in Luzon, that's about 600 megawatts out already of the 1.5 that I told you
I'll
about.
try to insert one question before we end this interview, Bert. We've been listening to some of the presidential candidates over the past few weeks, and there's been talk of reviving the nuclear plant in Bataan. What do you make of this?
Well, you know, I don't think that the new nuclear plant is operable. It may not be a realistic option. You know that you cannot just operate a nuclear power plant. You have to meet not just national but international standards. So before we consider that option, we should find out, is that really an option? If we want to go nuclear, let's find out if that's exactly what we need. Now, as I pointed out earlier, a nuclear power plant, if you look at the characteristic, it's a baseload power plant. It's the flattest. It's the one that should operate at the most constant level. That is not the nature of our load in the Philippines. Like I said, we have a very variable load. We need more flexibility in our system. So the nuclear power plant is not exactly the kind of power plant we need for the characteristic load of the Philippines.
Thank you so much for your insights and for joining us in the Final Word. Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, Bert Dalusung.